Early 1943. The white sands of the Tunisian desert stretch toward a brilliant, unforgiving blue horizon. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a veteran fighter pilot of Jagdgeschwader 27, sits in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, the engine idling with a low, metallic growl. He has survived the Russian winter and the battles of North Africa, earning his Iron Cross through blood and skill. Stigler is a professional who knows the sky. He knows that his Messerschmitt is a masterpiece of European engineering, sleek, fast, and agile. He knows that the single-seat, single-engine fighter is the absolute apex of modern aerial combat. To him, any aircraft with two engines is a bomber, a transport, or a heavy, lumbering target. He looks up and spots a blemish in the distant blue. As the shape draws closer, his brow furrows under his leather helmet. The approaching aircraft has two separate tails, twin engines housed in long, metallic booms, and a central pod where the pilot sits. It is a silhouette unlike anything he has ever seen in the skies of Europe. In the strict tactical manuals of the German Luftwaffe, a twin-engine fighter is known as a destroyer. Stigler remembers the heavy Messerschmitt Bf 110, which had been designed with the same layout. During the Battle of Britain, those heavy destroyers had been easily swept from the sky by nimble, single-engine British Spitfires and Hurricanes. To a battle-hardened ace like Stigler, a twin-engine fighter is a sluggish, slow-rolling behemoth. It is too heavy to dogfight, too slow to climb, and too easy to hit. He smiles behind his oxygen mask and turns his Messerschmitt toward the strange intruder. He is confident that this will be another quick, routine victory mark on his rudder. He has no way of knowing that this strange twin-tailed machine was built by a system that does not play by European rules. He does not know that this aircraft, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, is about to turn his entire understanding of aerial warfare upside down, bringing a catastrophic end to his well-earned confidence. The story of the P-38 began not in the desperation of wartime, but in the quiet offices of the Lockheed Corporation in Burbank, California. In February 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued a highly demanding specification for a high-altitude interceptor capable of defending the American mainland from potential long-range bomber threats. The military demanded a top speed of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and the ability to climb to that altitude in just 6 minutes. In 1937, these performance requirements were considered science fiction. No single piston engine in existence could generate the massive horsepower required to meet these targets. Most aircraft manufacturers looked at the specification and deemed it mathematically impossible. They believed that any plane large enough to house the necessary machinery would be too heavy to fly effectively. But a brilliant young Lockheed engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson refused to accept the conventional limits of aviation design. Johnson was a man who looked at the laws of physics not as a barrier, but as a set of rules to be negotiated. He realized that if a single engine could not provide the required speed and climb rate, the aircraft would simply have to carry two. But two engines presented a massive design challenge. Placing two engines on the wings of a traditional fuselage created immense aerodynamic drag and weight. It also made the aircraft slow to roll, a fatal flaw for a fighter plane. Johnson's solution was radical, elegant, and unlike anything that had ever flown. He decided to throw away the traditional fuselage altogether. He designed a twin-boom configuration where the pilot sat in a highly streamlined central pod suspended between two massive parallel metal booms. Each boom would house a 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled Allison V1710 engine. These booms stretched all the way back to the tail, supporting the twin rudders and a single horizontal stabilizer. This unique architecture solved the problem of housing two massive engines while keeping the aircraft incredibly aerodynamic. It gave the P-38 a futuristic, intimidating silhouette that would soon become famous across the globe. But Kelly Johnson was not finished. He knew that raw engine power was only half of the equation at high altitudes. At 30,000 feet, the air is thin and cold, starving an engine of the oxygen it needs to burn fuel. To solve this, Johnson incorporated advanced turbo superchargers directly into the twin booms, positioned behind the engines. These turbo superchargers were driven by the hot exhaust gases of the engines, compressing the thin air before feeding it to the carburetors. This meant that as the P-38 climbed higher, it did not lose power. It actually grew faster, maintaining its maximum performance in the thin, freezing air where traditional engines choked. The aircraft was designed to operate in a realm that German fighters could barely reach, giving American pilots a decisive high-altitude advantage. When the prototype XP-38 took to the skies in January 1939, it shattered every existing aviation record. Piloted by Lieutenant Ben Kelsey, the futuristic machine flew from California to New York in just 7 hours and 48 minutes, hitting speeds over 400 miles per hour. The world had never seen anything like it. Yet, as the war in Europe began to rage, the German Luftwaffe remained blissfully unaware of this technological leap. Their intelligence service looked at reports of the twin-engine American fighter and dismissed it as a propaganda stunt. They believed that a twin-engine plane could never compete with their own nimble Messerschmitt Bf 109. The German aviation industry was built on the philosophy of the light, agile, single-engine fighter. The Messerschmitt was their crown jewel, a combat-proven machine that had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. German pilots were highly trained professionals who had spent years refining their high-speed vertical tactics. They believed that American industrial design was primitive and clumsy. To them, the Americans were builders of heavy tractors and cheap, mass-produced cars, not high-performance war machines. This dismissal was not based on mere arrogance, but on their own highly successful experiences against every air force they had encountered up to that point. They were about to discover that the P-38 was built with a completely different philosophy of lethality, one that capitalized on the raw, industrialized abundance of the American manufacturing system. This philosophy was most evident in the way Kelly Johnson designed the armament of the new fighter. In a traditional single-engine fighter, the machine guns and cannons were mounted inside the wings. Because the guns were separated by the width of the wings, they had to be carefully calibrated so that their streams of fire crossed at a specific distance in front of the aircraft, a process known as harmonization. If a pilot fired at an enemy that was closer or farther away than this intersection point, the bullets would scatter, passing harmlessly on either side of the target. This meant that dogfighting required immense skill, precision, and perfect timing to ensure the enemy was at the exact range where the fire converged. Kelly Johnson saw this as an unnecessary complication. He did not put a single gun in the wings of the P-38. Instead, he packed all the weapons into the very nose of the central pod. The nose housed 4.50 caliber machine guns and one heavy 20mm cannon aligned in parallel. This meant there was no convergence zone. The P-38 fired its devastating array of weapons in a straight, concentrated column of lead and steel. A pilot could hit a target at 50 yards or 500 yards with the exact same lethal accuracy, tearing an enemy aircraft to shreds with a single pull of the trigger. The concentrated fire of the P-38 was like a high-speed saw, cutting through wings, engines, and cockpits with terrifying ease. In addition, the central armament allowed American pilots to fire from much longer ranges than their German opponents, striking before the enemy could even bring their own guns to bear. Furthermore, Johnson solved a fundamental aerodynamic problem that plagued single-engine fighters. When a Sun single-engine plane flew at high speed, the spinning propeller created a powerful rotational force known as torque, which pulled the aircraft violently to one side. Pilots had to constantly fight this force using the rudder, especially during tight turns. The P-38 solved this by using counter-rotating propellers. The left engine spun clockwise while the right engine spun counterclockwise. This completely eliminated engine torque, making the aircraft an incredibly stable gun platform. When an American pilot pulled the trigger, the aircraft did not shake or pull. It remained rock steady. This aerodynamic balance made the P-38 highly forgiving to fly, allowing even novice pilots to make precise maneuvers and land devastating shots under the intense pressure of combat. It was a machine designed to translate raw industrial precision into immediate lethal success in the sky. The first encounter between this American engineering reality and German tactical assumption occurred in the freezing skies of Northern Europe. On August 14, 1942, a P-38 of the 27th Fighter Squadron was flying a routine patrol over the coast of Iceland, searching for German reconnaissance aircraft. The American pilot spotted a German Focke-Wulf F-2200 Condor, a massive four-engine maritime patrol bomber. The German crew was accustomed to flying long, peaceful missions over the Atlantic, far from any Allied fighters. They saw the strange twin-tailed aircraft diving toward them from the clouds and assumed it was harmless. Within seconds, the P-38 closed the distance, its nose-mounted guns erupting in a brief, concentrated burst of fire. The heavy German bomber was torn apart in a matter of moments, its engines bursting into flames as it spiraled into the icy Atlantic. It was the first German aircraft shot down by an American fighter in the war. It was a quiet, sudden victory that sent a shockwave through the Luftwaffe command. But the true test of the P-38 would not take place over the lonely waters of the North Atlantic. It would happen in the burning, crowded skies over North Africa, where the elite of the German fighter force was waiting. In November 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, landing American and British forces in Morocco and Algeria. The Luftwaffe reacted with desperate speed, moving their most experienced, battle-hardened fighter wings, including Jagdgeschwader 77 and Jagdgeschwader 53, to the airfields of Tunisia. These German units were led by legendary aces who had survived hundreds of aerial duels on the eastern and western fronts. They were masters of the Messerschmitt, men who had honed their tactics to perfection. When they first saw the P-38 over the Tunisian mountains, their initial reaction was one of pure amusement. To these veteran pilots, the American plane looked absurd. It was twice the size of their own fighters, with a massive wingspan and a strange, bulky double fuselage. They assumed that such a large, heavy machine would be a clumsy, easy target in a dogfight, rolling slowly and struggling to climb. They mockingly called it the flying boxcar, or the double-tailed target. They joked that the Americans had sent them a transport plane instead of a fighter, and they eagerly anticipated adding easy victories to their combat records. But their laughter would not survive the first week of active combat. They were about to discover that the P-38 was not a heavy, sluggish destroyer in the mold of their own Messerschmitt Bf-1 Du-10. It was an agile, powerful predator that could turn inside their Messerschmitts, climb out of danger in an instant, and strike with terrifying power from long range. If your family has a story connected to the men who flew or maintained the P-38 Lightning during these critical campaigns, those personal accounts belong in the historical record. Please share those memories in the comments below, as they provide a vital link to this remarkable era of technological transformation. Johannes Steinhoff, a brilliant German ace who would end the war with 176 aerial victories, was one of the first to face the P-38 in combat over Sicily in North Africa. He would later write in his memoirs that the twin-engine American fighter possessed a turning capability that shocked the German pilots. Steinhoff noted that his Messerschmitt Bf-109 was slightly faster in level flight, but a dogfight with the P-38 was a daunting and terrifying experience. The American fighter had an incredibly tight turning radius, allowing it to quickly swing onto the tail of a German fighter and bring its concentrated guns to bear. He realized that the reports of his pilots regarding the P-38's maneuverability were not exaggerations. The heavy-looking fighter could use its unique Fowler flaps to increase lift and decrease its turning circle, allowing it to easily outmaneuver the lighter German aircraft in a close-quarters dogfight. Another legendary German ace, Franz Stigler, who flew Messerschmitts against the P-38 over the Tunisian desert, would also recount his respect for the American fighter. Stigler wrote that the Lightning could turn inside them with ease and could transition from level flight to a steep climb almost instantaneously. The German pilots quickly learned that their favorite defensive maneuver, the high-speed dive followed by a vertical pull-up, was a fatal mistake when facing the P-38. In the past, they could dive away from British Spitfires, pull up into a steep climb, and watch the enemy stall out beneath them. But when they tried this against the P-38, the American fighter simply climbed with them, using its twin-engine power and turbo superchargers to maintain its speed. The German pilots would look back and see the twin booms of the Lightning rising steadily behind them, its nose-mounted guns locked onto their cockpits. Stigler wrote that they lost quite a few experienced pilots who tried to make a diving attack and then pull up, only to be shredded by the concentrated fire of the P-38. The German pilots had to abandon their established tactics. Realizing that their assumptions about twin-engine fighters were completely obsolete, the Luftwaffe command was forced to issue a strict and unprecedented tactical order to all fighter units in the Mediterranean theater. German pilots were forbidden from ever engaging a P-38 in a head-on pass. It was a rule born out of sheer desperation and a heavy toll of lost aircraft and pilots. In a head-on attack, a German pilot had to fly directly into the path of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon firing in a straight line with no convergence limits. The Messerschmitt's nose guns were too light and its wing guns too scattered to compete with that concentrated wall of lead. The physical reality of the P-38 was shattering the psychological foundations of the Luftwaffe's elite. They had spent years believing that their technology and training made them invincible. Now, they were finding themselves hunted by a machine that defied every rule of aerial combat they had spent their careers mastering. The skies over North Africa were rapidly turning into a grim proving ground. The German pilots were beginning to realize that the P-38 was not just a strange aircraft, but the vanguard of an industrial machine that could produce high-altitude, long-range quality in numbers they could not even begin to match. The laughter that had greeted the first sightings of the twin-tailed fighter had vanished entirely. In its place was a silent, growing dread. The German pilots began to refer to the P-38 as Der Gebelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. The twin booms of the lightning had hunted them across the desert, and they were retreating. Yet, as the Mediterranean campaign drew to a close, the German commanders comforted themselves with the belief that this was a localized crisis. They assumed that the American fighter would remain confined to the long distances of the desert and the Pacific, and could not survive the high-altitude freezing skies of northern Europe. They believed that over the German homeland, their newly fortified air defense system would easily crush the twin-engine interloper. They were about to learn that the American industrial system was already preparing to scale its production, sending thousands of improved Lightnings to cross the English Channel and hunt them in their own skies. As the winter of 1943 arrived, the air war shifted northward to the occupied territories of France and the borders of the German Reich itself. The United States Army Air Forces launched a relentless daylight bombing campaign targeting German factories, refineries, and shipyards. But the American bombers were taking devastating losses from German fighter defense. The heavy B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators had to fly hundreds of miles into enemy territory without escort. The existing Allied fighters, including the British Spitfire, did not have the fuel capacity to accompany the bombers deep into Germany, leaving them vulnerable to the elite interceptor wings of the Luftwaffe. The German commanders calculated that the Americans would be forced to halt their daylight bombing campaign due to the unsustainable rate of bomber losses. Their calculations were mathematically sound, based on all historical precedents. They believed that no fighter could be built with both the maneuverability to survive dogfights and the range to fly deep into Germany. Once again, the German calculations failed to include the radical engineering of the P-38. In September 1943, the Lockheed fighter began operating from airfields in England, equipped with massive auxiliary drop tanks suspended beneath its wings. These drop tanks gave the P-38 a strategic range of over 1,300 miles. For the first time in history, the German fighter pilots rose to intercept the American bomber formations over their own homeland, only to find themselves blocked by a wall of twin-engine fighters. The Lightning was the only Allied fighter in 1943 with the range to protect the bombers deep into the heart of Germany. The German interceptor wings, accustomed to slaughtering unarmed lumbering bombers, suddenly found themselves locked in desperate high-altitude battles with the fork-tailed devil. The P-38 was flying at 28,000 feet, using its turbo-superchargers to maintain maximum speed in the thin, freezing air where the Messerschmitts struggled to breathe. The air battles over the Reich became vast, chaotic spectacles of modern industrial warfare. Hundreds of aircraft wheeled and dived through the freezing sky, leaving a dense web of white condensation trails that stretched for miles across the German landscape. The P-38 pilots fought with a fierce determination, knowing they were the only shield protecting the bombers. The German fighter aces, who had dominated the European skies for 4 years, were now forced to fight for their lives on every single mission. They found that the P-38 was a relentless opponent, capable of absorbing massive amounts of damage and still returning home on a single engine. The twin-engine design of the Lightning, which German pilots had once mockingly dismissed, was now proving to be an incredible survival asset. If a Messerschmitt managed to damage one of the P-38's Allison engines, the American pilot could simply feather the propeller, shut down the burning engine, and fly home on the other. Dozens of American pilots survived engine failures and battle damage over the North Sea and the occupied territories that would have been instantly fatal in a single-engine fighter. They returned to their bases in England, their aircraft riddled with bullet holes, but their lives intact. This twin-engine survivability created a profound psychological comfort for the American pilots, allowing them to fly long, terrifying missions over water and enemy territory with an unshakable confidence in their machines. This confidence stood in stark contrast to the growing exhaustion of the German pilots. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was beginning to buckle under the sheer weight of the American industrial onslaught. The P-38 was not just a fighter plane. It was the tip of a spear powered by a manufacturing machine that was producing aircraft faster than the Germans could shoot them down. In Burbank, California, the Lockheed factories were operating 24 hours a day, utilizing massive, moving assembly lines to produce a complete 38 every few hours. The raw material abundance of the United States was being translated directly into aerial supremacy over Europe. The German pilots, who had laughed at the strange, bulky twin-boom fighter over the desert, were now staring up at a sky that was filled with them. The first phase of the Great Collision between German assumption and American industrial reality had ended, and the German worldview was beginning to fracture. But the climax of this struggle was still to come as the air war reached its peak of violence in the freezing winter skies of 1944. The German pilots had learned to respect the fork-tailed devil, but they had not yet faced the full, devastating reality of its final evolution. The transition from 1943 to 1944 marked the most violent and decisive phase of the air war over Northern Europe. In the freezing, high-altitude arena above Germany, the early models of the P-38 Lightning had faced severe, unexpected operational challenges that the veteran pilots of the Luftwaffe tried desperately to exploit. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, where the air temperature was colder than -40 degrees, the early P-38 cockpits had no adequate heating systems. American pilots suffered from severe, crippling frostbite, their fingers freezing to the control yokes as they struggled to maintain formation during long escort missions. Furthermore, the massive turbo-supercharged Allison engines suffered from severe oil cooling issues in the thin, cold air. The engine oil would become too thick to circulate, leading to sudden, catastrophic mechanical failures far from friendly territory. The German pilots, observing these smoke-trailing engine failures, believed that the Lightning was fundamentally fragile. The most dangerous challenge, however, was a physical phenomenon known as compressibility. In a high-speed dive, as the P-38 approached the speed of sound, the airflow over the wings became highly turbulent, causing the nose of the aircraft to pitch down violently and freezing the control yoke in the pilot's hands. Many early P-38 pilots were lost when they entered a high-speed dive to pursue a fleeing German fighter, only to find themselves completely unable to pull out of the descent. The Luftwaffe pilots, noticing this weakness, would intentionally dive at steep angles, knowing the American fighters could not safely follow them. The German command believed that these technical limitations would permanently restrict the strategic effectiveness of the P-38 over Northern Europe. They reasoned that the American industrial system, with its heavy reliance on mass production, could not adapt quickly enough to solve such complex aerodynamic problems in the middle of a conflict. Their reasoning was based on traditional European manufacturing standards, where modifications to military aircraft were slow, handcrafted processes that took years to complete. They did not understand the agility of the American industrial machine, which could redesign, test, and implement major engineering changes on the assembly line in a matter of months. In Burbank, California, Kelly Johnson and his team of engineers worked tirelessly to address the urgent combat feedback from the European front. Their rapid response was the P-38J model, which introduced massive technical improvements that transformed the aircraft from a formidable challenger into a dominant weapon of absolute aerial supremacy. To solve the engine cooling problem, the J model featured enlarged, distinctive chin radiators beneath the propellers, which allowed the Allison engines to run at optimal temperatures even in the freezing air of high altitudes. The cockpit heating system was completely redesigned, providing pilots with the warmth they needed to stay alert. To combat the deadly effects of compressibility, Lockheed engineers developed innovative electrically operated dive flaps beneath the wings. These dive flaps controlled the turbulent airflow during high-speed descents, allowing the pilot to maintain complete control of the aircraft and pull out of steep dives with ease and safety. Finally, the J model introduced hydraulically boosted ailerons, which dramatically increased the aircraft's rate of roll. This made the large, twin-engine fighter incredibly agile in close-quarters dogfights, allowing it to roll and turn with the speed of any single-engine German fighter it encountered in the sky. The German pilots, rising to meet the American bomber formations in early 1944, were shocked by the sudden, terrifying transformation of their opponent. The aircraft they had once been able to escape by diving was now following them down at near-sonic speeds, its nose guns firing with devastating accuracy. The tactical advantage that the Luftwaffe had enjoyed was completely vanishing. The P-38J could dive faster, roll quicker, and maintain its high-altitude performance with complete mechanical reliability, leaving the German pilots with no safe escape route when the twin-boom fighters began their high-altitude hunt. The reality of this technological leap was accompanied by a relentless escalation in manufacturing numbers. The American industrial machine was delivering these advanced J models to the European theater by the hundreds, replacing lost aircraft and expanding fighter groups at a rate that defied any German strategic calculation. If you have encountered different numbers or unique primary sources in your own historical research regarding the air battles of 1944, those details are highly valuable to this community. The comment section is where this history remains accurate, so please share your findings below. The psychological collapse of the German fighter force was not a sudden event, but a slow, crushing realization that their brave resistance was mathematically futile. This collapse was deeply felt by individual German pilots who found themselves facing impossible, overwhelming odds on every single combat mission. Major Franz Schiess, an elite German ace with 67 aerial victories, had earned the reputation of being the leading lightning killer in the Luftwaffe, having shot down 17 P-38 fighters over the Mediterranean. He was a professional who believed that his skill could overcome any American machine. Yet, on August 30th, 1943, Schiess took off on his final mission, escorting bombers near the Italian coast. His formation was intercepted by a large group of 38 fighters. In the chaotic battle that followed, the veteran ace was shot down and killed, his Messerschmitt crashing into the sea. The loss of an elite pilot like Schiess was a devastating blow to the morale of his wing, Jagdgeschwader 53. The German pilots began to realize that no matter how skilled they were, they could not survive the constant, aggressive presence of the twin-boom fighters. The German fighter wings were being ground down through attrition, losing their most experienced leaders while the Americans continued to send fresh, highly trained pilots into the sky. The balance of power had shifted permanently, and the Luftwaffe was running out of time. This sense of hopelessness was vividly illustrated by the experience of a young German pilot in Tunisia. After a desperate engagement with a flight of 38 fighters, the pilot found himself completely separated from his unit, his engine damaged, and his ammunition exhausted. Looking up, he saw the twin booms of a P-38 circling above him, waiting for him to make a move. The German pilot, overwhelmed by panic and exhaustion, decided that he could no longer fight this relentless enemy. He lowered his landing gear and steered his damaged plane toward an Allied airfield. Upon landing, he surrendered to the startled American soldiers, frantically pointing to the sky and shouting the words, "Der Gebelschwanz Teufel," over and over again. His spirit had been completely broken not by a tactical defeat, but by the psychological weight of an adversary that seemed to be everywhere. This private reckoning was happening across the entire German command. Staff officers and supply commanders looked at the daily replacement reports and felt a quiet, growing horror. They knew that while Germany was struggling to produce a few hundred fighters a month, American factories were producing thousands. The industrial mathematics of the conflict were simple and brutal. The United States was producing millions of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline, while the German fuel reserves were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing raids, leaving German pilots with barely enough fuel to train or fly. Experienced German aces were forced to fly 3 or 4 combat sorties a day, their bodies worn thin by constant adrenaline and lack of sleep. They were fighting a defensive war against an enemy that possessed an apparently infinite supply of machines, fuel, and fresh pilots. The P-38 had successfully cleared the Mediterranean skies, protected the heavy bombers deep into Germany, and paved the way for the ultimate liberation of Europe. The twin-boom fighter had fulfilled every strategic expectation that Kelly Johnson and the Army Air Corps had envisioned. While the P-38 was achieving these victories in Europe, it was in the Pacific theater that the aircraft achieved its most famous operational triumph. The vast distances of the Pacific made the twin-engine design and long range of the Lightning an absolute necessity for American pilots. In the Pacific, the P-38 became the primary instrument of American aerial supremacy. It was the aircraft flown by the top 2 American aces of the entire war, Major Richard Bong, who scored 40 aerial victories, and Major Thomas Maguire, who was credited with 38. On April 18, 1943, a squadron of P-38 Lightnings flew a precisely timed 400-mile low-altitude mission over the island of Bougainville. Their target was a Japanese transport bomber carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. The mission required absolute navigational precision and long-range capability that no other fighter in the world possessed. The P-38 pilots intersected the Japanese flight exactly on schedule, shooting down the Admiral's aircraft and delivering a major psychological blow to the Japanese Empire. This legendary mission cemented the strategic legacy of the P-38 as one of the most versatile and impactful aircraft in military history. It was a machine that could perform high-altitude intercept missions, long-range escorts, tactical dive bombing, and targeted strategic strikes with equal effectiveness. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Lockheed Corporation had produced a total of 10,037 P-38 Lightnings of all models. It was the only American fighter aircraft that remained in continuous active production, from the start of the war to its very end. The massive assembly lines in Burbank, California, had proved that a democratic, industrial system could outproduce and out-engineer the totalitarian regimes of the Axis powers, delivering a level of quality and quantity that shattered their rivals' assumptions. The ultimate success of the P-38 was not just a victory of numbers, however. It was a victory of human ingenuity, adaptability, and the courage of the young men who climbed into those freezing, complex cockpits to face the elite of the Luftwaffe. The German pilots who had once laughed at the strange, double-tailed shape in the Tunisian sky had learned a painful historical lesson. They had learned that the American industrial system did not just build tractors and cars, but produced some of the finest warplanes ever designed. The memory of those twin booms flashing in the high-altitude sun would remain with the surviving German pilots for the rest of their lives. They had faced an adversary that their entire worldview could not contain, and they had been defeated by the quiet, relentless mathematics of democratic industrialism. Today, only a handful of airworthy Lockheed P-38 Lightnings remain in existence, preserved in museums and private collections around the world. These beautiful, polished machines are silent witnesses to a time when the entire fate of the free world rested on the shoulders of engineers and young pilots. When we look at the twin-boom silhouette of the Lightning today, we do not just see a weapon of war. We see the triumph of free minds working together to solve impossible problems under the greatest pressure in human history. We see the real greatness of the arsenal of democracy. In Burbank, California, the human element of the American industrial miracle was on full display. The Lockheed factories were staffed by tens of thousands of ordinary citizens, including thousands of women who had stepped forward to build the complex twin-engine fighters while the men fought overseas. These factory workers, collectively known as Rosie the Riveter, brought a high level of precision and dedication to the assembly lines. They understood that a loose rivet or a faulty wire could cost an American pilot his life, and they worked with a sense of personal responsibility that matched the pilot's bravery. The Burbank facility was a marvel of modern industrial organization, utilizing massive moving assembly lines that carried the fuselage pods and tail booms through the factory floor. Every worker performed a specific, highly refined task, maximizing efficiency and minimizing the production time of each aircraft. This industrialized approach to aircraft manufacturing was something the German command had never anticipated. They believed that high-performance fighter planes could only be built by highly skilled master craftsmen working in small, specialized workshops. They did not understand that mass production could deliver both quantity and unmatched quality. The P-38 was a testament to the success of this American industrial philosophy, combining advanced scientific research, mass production techniques, and the dedication of ordinary citizens to produce a weapon that altered the course of the global conflict. The German fighter pilots, flying their handcrafted Messerschmitts, found themselves overwhelmed by this relentless flow of American machinery. They were no longer just fighting against individual pilots. They were fighting against an entire economic system that was dedicated to their destruction. Johannes Steinhoff would later observe that the sheer material abundance of the American forces was the most devastating aspect of the air war. He noted that while his pilots had to conserve ammunition and fuel, the American pilots could fire thousands of rounds and fly for hours without concern. This material contrast was felt on every single mission. A German pilot might spend hours preparing his single-engine fighter, only to find himself outnumbered 10-1 by a formation of P-38 Lightnings that had flown over 1,000 miles to strike his airfield. The psychological toll of this endless material superiority was profound. The German pilots knew that even if they shot down a P-38, 3 more would roll off the assembly line in California to replace it, while their own losses of aircraft and pilots were permanent and irreplaceable. The physical and mental exhaustion of the Luftwaffe pilots led to a rapid decline in their combat effectiveness. Many of the young, inexperienced pilots sent to replace the fallen aces had only a few hours of training, making them easy targets for the highly proficient American fighter groups. The P-38 played a critical role in this war of attrition, hunting the German fighters at high altitudes and attacking their airfields on the ground, systematically dismantling the infrastructure of the Luftwaffe until they could no longer mount an effective defense. When the war in Europe finally came to an end in May 1945, the skies over Germany were silent. The once mighty Luftwaffe had been completely destroyed, its aircraft wrecked on the runways and its pilots scattered or captured. The fork-tailed devil had finished its hunt. The P-38 was quickly retired from active service after the war, as the dawn of the jet age made piston-engine fighters obsolete. The United States military had no further need for the complex, expensive twin-engine aircraft, and thousands of Lightnings were sold for scrap or melted down. This rapid demobilization was a characteristic of the American democratic system, which had built its massive military machine only to defeat totalitarianism, and was eager to return its factories to the production of peaceful consumer goods. The weapons of war had served their purpose, yet the legacy of the P-38 lived on in the memories of the men who had flown it, the workers who had built it, and the enemies who had feared it. It remained an iconic symbol of the moment when American technology and industrial might saved the free world. The stories of the P-38 pilots, from the freezing skies of Iceland to the hot sands of Tunisia and the vast distances of the Pacific, are a testament to the courage, skill, vain, and humanity that defined the real greatness of the United States during its greatest trial. The German pilots who had once laughed at the strange, double-tailed shape had been forced to admit that they were wrong, their confidence shattered by a machine that redefined the limits of what was possible in the sky. Their testimony is the ultimate proof of the P-38's achievement. The industrial mathematics of the war had spoken, proving that a system built on freedom, cooperation, and human dignity could produce a level of abundance and technological brilliance that no totalitarian regime could ever match. The fork-tailed devil had driven that lesson home. As we look back on this remarkable history, we are reminded of the immense sacrifices made by both sides, and the profound tragedy of a global conflict that claimed the lives of so many brave and talented young men. We honor their memory by telling their stories with dignity. The next account of American democratic industrial achievement is already prepared, documenting another dimension of what this nation produced when tested at its fullest, showing how machines and ordinary citizens came together to defend the principles of freedom. The industrial stories of American democratic achievement are not exhausted by any single account. Each operation, each weapon system, each logistical miracle reveals another dimension of what this country produced when tested at its fullest. The next account is prepared,